Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video we're going to be looking at how to paint this plasma gun. I don't know what the actual name of the weapon is, but I know it's some form of plasma gun. And this is for the Redemptor Dreadnought that I've been painting for my army. So as you can see, it's not a highly finished paint job, with perfect blending and things like that, but it's pretty good for tabletop standard at the very least. And you can take the principles that I'm going to show you for how to paint this plasma and then push them further if you want, improve the blending or things like that. So we've just been through the paints that we're going to be using for the first stage. Now for the first stage we're going to be just painting the black, and the reason we're having to do the black before I show you how to do the purple plasma is because you have to paint some of the glow around the plasma which goes over the black. So if you haven't got the black painted, with all the highlights and things already on it, then you're going to struggle when it's time to put the plasma glow down, because you still have to paint the black armor afterwards then, and in fact you'll be painting in reverse, and it's not very easy, and this is just the best way to do it. So to start off with, you can see I've got all the paints kind of mixed already on the wet palette. Now if you were paying attention when I was showing you the paints, there were 4 paints, and you'll notice there are 5 on the wet palette. That's because the middle paint, so the third one down or third one up, doesn't matter which way you look at it, is a 50-50 mix of neutral grey and German grey. And that's just so that I've got another transition on the wet palette, so it just makes it a little bit quicker and easier to mix the colours together. You can see I'd already started off painting some marks down. This is so I started off with the mixture, actually the 50-50 one, and then I'm moving into German grey as well here. So it's starting off at the very bottom of the gun is the lightest point, and then it travels up to go darker and darker all the way up towards the skull. Then there is a highlight line on the curve. It's really nice when you get these curves. I'm also going to be picking this out on the plasma coils as well. It looks really nice to highlight that. It's a natural highlight point on the weapon, because it's a curve. I mention this every video. If it's a curve, then it concentrates the light. So you can see there I've done very, very rough blending. Now the blending overall on all the black that we're going to see here is very rough. Like I said, this is a tabletop model. For me, I'm not too excuse my dog. I'm not too worried about getting everything perfect, but as long as the contrasts are there and there's some nice bit of detailing and things, it'll look pretty good for to game with. Or you can use it for display also. Really, it's not like it's going to be bad. It's just that for the really fine close-up stuff, I'm not going to be spending the time for that. Every now and then you're going to see that I'm going to swap the gun over to the other side. So that was the previously done side. You may have seen that on the social media. So the idea is I have to make that match, or reasonably closely anyway. I'm not super concerned about it being perfectly matching, but pretty close is ideal. And you're going to see that when I'm painting these highlights on, so when I've used the first highlight, it was the 50-50 mix. Then I've gone German grey beside that, but then I'm going to highlight on top of the mix. So I'm not going in a logical what you'd probably think of logical steps. I'm not just going black, German grey, mix, neutral grey, pale blue grey. Which is what you can do that if you want. It's just that if you start with a slightly lighter colour, it's much easier to see where you've placed it, and you get the highlight points much more clearly, and then you can blend those in. So you're kind of like starting with the mid-tone and then working up and working down, rather than just starting very low and then slowly layering up. The other benefit of doing it this way is that you tend to have fewer layers, so you don't get quite as much paint build-up. So if you started at German grey and then kept adding more and more layers as you go up, then you've got all 5 layers. So you've got the black primer, the German grey, the mix, neutral grey, heavy blue grey, all through that stage, those stages. Whereas if you start with the mix, you've already cut out the German greys at the first layer. Having said that, I mean, you still need a fairly opaque layer down, but it doesn't have to be perfect, because you will layer on top of it as well. And also there's going to be glazing, and because of the glazing it'll help to pull it all together a little bit as well. So it will tidy up as you go along, but don't worry too much about it being perfect. So these curve lines, they all have to line up. If you put one a little bit higher and one a little bit lower, it will be fairly obvious and it just look a bit dumb. And the other thing is, you have to be a bit careful as you move this around. The light, the highlight that you see from the lamp that I'm using, it will move slightly, and that's because it's quite a large curve. So in some points, it's going to be the curve will be a little bit higher than where I've painted it on, and at some point it's going to be a little bit lower. You have to pick whichever point you think is going to look best and stick to it. Don't paint one small area, move it a little bit, and then try and follow it still, because it's not going to match up and it'll just look wrong. So for the highlight lines that I'm putting on, I'm trying to roughly match them to the other side of the gun as well, so it's symmetrical. I mean, it's not super necessary, because you'll never see both sides of the gun at the same time. And if you wanted, you could do completely different highlights on this side of the gun to the other one. I just find it keeps it kind of consistent, so when people are looking around the model, they're not going to pick it out as being too different. They'll just accept, that's the way it's been highlighted. However, if you were painting this with a very strong directional lighting, which is much harder with a vehicle, because it's so large and has such strong flat surfaces. If you do like the directional lighting like that, you can't get the reflected light very easily with the flat surfaces, and being so big, it makes it really, really obvious. Like if you're only viewing it from one direction, it actually look really dramatic. You'd have very strong highlight flat surfaces and things, but when you turn it around, or just even turn it a slight amount, it's going to look very strange. So if you're doing it for a diorama, then go for the strong directional lighting. But if you're doing it for a gaming piece that you have to move around, then try and be a bit more subtle, I'd advise, just because it'll look really strange on the gaming table. From every time you move it, the lighting stays the same. So you can see here, I'm just very, very roughly blending these sections in. They don't look as bad as this in the flesh, actually. This is obviously zoomed in quite a lot. What you'll find as well is, so I'm using Vallejo model color black, and that has a slightly more matte effect than the black primer. So you can see where I used the black primer, and it has a very strong, obvious difference between that and the grey paint that I've put on top of it. When you use the Vallejo black right next to the German grey, it just blends it in. It's more of a subtle colour, because it's got the same finish as the rest of the paints. Whereas if you leave anywhere that's a primer black, then it's going to stand out just because it has a different finish. It has a slightly satin finish on it. So you can see here the blending technique that I'm using. It's very messy, but it's very, very simple. I use it quite a lot, but more refined probably in other models. But I start off with the kind of the grey base, and I add the highlight colour on. Then I go back to the grey that I've painted over it with, without washing off the brush, and then it kind of like mixes on the model. Then if you look at the marks that I'm making, they're very scribbly. I'm not looking for a fully opaque finish. So all these little scribbles and things, it kind of works like pointillism. So, you know, lots of little dots, but in this case it's more like the scratches building up. And, you know, all the marks work together, and it kind of works like camouflage. So there's no strong, distinct line in between each kind of highlight layer. What you'll tend to find is if you do things, if you do highlight layers and you do a very straight line in between each layer, so it looks like steps, it's very hard to get rid of those. You can be glazing, and you glaze a lot, and even then, when it starts to blend in, you can still see a definite step in between each line, each highlight line. Whereas if you do it like this, where it's really scribbly, one, it's a lot quicker and easier, and two, as you glaze over it, it just all kind of becomes very soft, because, as I said, it's like you're just softening the transition between each layer, and the layer isn't obvious anyway, so it's not like a definite one step, two step between lighter and darker. Here you can see I'm painting the upper and vertical edges, never the lower facing edges though. So it's a little bit like Games Workshop style with the edges, but that's because would be naturally how the light catches it anyway. I mean, you can kind of see that already. If you look at any of the parts on the model that are just prime black, you can see the edge catches the light more naturally. Whereas I'm kind of just emphasizing that. So it's, I mean, obviously, if you look at the black primer section, it's not as bright as I'm doing it with the paint, obviously. So you are picking sections out and making them stronger than they would naturally be. But you're still trying to keep it natural for the position of the light. And this just creates nice contrasts and things like that with these hard edges. Don't worry too much about the edges around the plasma, because I'm going to paint over those with the plasma glow anyway. But I just find, because it's so quick to do this, you know, I'm just painting the edge and picking out the hard line. And if you notice, I'm using just the tip of the edge of the brush. Don't use the tip itself. If you use the tip itself, then you have to paint it very carefully and slowly by hand. If you make any mistakes as well, you can just use the grey paint. So this is the benefit of having a wet palette. You've got all the paints there. So anytime you make a mistake, you can just pick the colour that you need and rub out whatever it is that you've done wrong. So yeah, there's obviously still a little bit of work to go between one side and the other, but you can see how it's slowly starting to come along now. So I'm just sticking in a few scratches on. I'm using neutral grey. It's going to stand out a lot. I'm not too bothered about them looking neat, but they will definitely stand out quite a bit. Again, don't worry about this. It'll go over, when you glaze over it, all of this will be toned down and look a lot smoother. So now I'm just going to paint in the rivets. This I'm using pale blue grey. They are very small, these rivets. If you struggle with this, don't worry too much about it. You're not going to see this too much on tabletop unless you're looking closely. It's just something I like to do just to keep me sharp, I guess. I don't know. Just because I can. I'm not doing it super neatly. I should use a newer brush that's a little bit neater as well. But all it is like a little dot on top and then a line underneath, so it looks like a little secondary bounce highlight. The reason for this as well is that I'm doing the rivets as very shiny, and all of the metal kind of extra parts on the gun, so like all the I guess the fuel cells and it's kind of like the barrel and some of the joining connections are going to be really shiny, almost white. So having the rivets with the same kind of brightness just kind of ties it all together. For these final lines, using the heavy blue grey, try and be careful with them. These do need to be a lot neater than the greys that you've already got down. because these stand out a lot more. There's a big tonal jump between the heavy blue grey and the other greys. Don't worry too much if you go a little bit wrong again. Like I say, you've got the other paints on there, you can blend them back in. But just try and keep these sort of neat and straight. And it just, having that neatness on top at the end really helps make the whole thing look neater. Whereas, so you can be really, really messy for a start and then just refine it a little bit as you go along. But then having, the final touch be neat just makes the whole thing look neat. And then the rest of the mess that you've made kind of looks just more like texture. You can just see I'm picking out the upwards facing edge on the bottom of the connecting curvy bit. I just missed that when I did the edge highlights. One thing I would recommend though is to paint the edge sections on the holes, the vents, I guess, at the front of the gun. Although wait to do that until you've painted the purple inside those holes, because otherwise you're likely to get purple over the top of it. I mean, you're going to get purple over the top anyway when you're painting the glow, but it'll just keep it neater, because then you can have more control when you start glazing some of the purples on and things like that. But yeah, you can see here, this line here, it's not really necessary because I'm going to be painting those edges all around the plasma coils are going to be purple highlight lines. But I just find that it helps me to visualize what I'm doing. When you're visualizing it because you're actually doing it, you can see what you're doing. It just helps it look clean as you're going along. And also when I apply the purple highlight, it'll go on much more cleanly because it's a white or a light base underneath it. Whereas if it's black, then you always risk having a little bit of the translucency showing some of the black primer underneath, and it won't be quite as bright. If you notice how I've painted on those little edge highlights near to the curved highlight on the top of the gun, they are obviously brighter because I've used the pale blue grey. Right on the curve, so the edge highlight kind of does work a little bit. Well, it works exactly the same as the main curved highlights because it's an edge, it attracts more light anyway, or it focuses more light. Sorry, but it's kind of like double focusing because it's still on the curve part as well. So the whole edge will be catching more light, but then the curved part will catch even more light. Yeah. Also, when you do this, when you do it as well, don't forget to paint the bottom of the gun. Right, so now we're going to be glazing on top of some of the work we've done. And I'm using Corvus Black. Now, Corvus Black is a dark grey. It's very similar to the German grey. I just like to glaze with the Games Workshop paints. One, it's going to make everything the same finish. So, where there's the primer on there, where it was a satin finish, and then some of the Vallejo paint is much more matte, particularly the model colour black. And it'll just get rid of some of the patchiness. We're going to be going over the highlights as well. I am going to be careful going over the brightest highlights, but any areas that become too dull after you've gone over them, you can just pick them out again afterwards. For doing this, you start on the lightest point that you want and then move towards the darkest. You might be straight away saying, oh, hang on a minute, you're using a dark grey to glaze on this, but you're painting a black weapon, it's all going to end up grey. To some extent that is true. However, you make something look darker with the contrast, not just painting it black. So because I'm going to paint the shiny metal parts on, because I've got the shiny rivets and because I've got the light edges, because they're so light, it makes the darker areas look darker. That's just normal tonal contrast. And you can already see just from one coat very quickly, it's kind of softening everything down. but also it's softening everything down, and it's making everything have the same finish. Now, if you want the finish to be matte, then after you've done the glazing, just give it a matte coat, matte varnish. Or you can glaze with the German grey finish. Although I prefer the colour of the Corvus black. It's very similar to German grey, but it's just a little bit more blue. And one final thing as well is even if you think it goes too grey, then you can use Abaddon black. Excuse me. You can use Abaddon black on top of it in the very darkest areas. Now, you have to be careful once you use the Abaddon black, because obviously it's a darker colour. So if you start glazing over the lighter areas with the Abaddon black, they might look a little bit dirty. So that the more the tonal contrast is with the area that you glaze over, the more likely it is to make a mess and not blend it, or it'll make a more visible mark. But what this will definitely do, starting with the Corvus black and then adding Abaddon black if you feel you need to, is it just makes everything look so much neater. So there we go. You can see here I just quickly picked out a couple of sections that were like little imperfections in the paintwork. So you saw at the beginning how I did the little squiggly sections, and then when it's all blended together, you can kind of like roughly still see them after the glazing work. Then I just went back with a neutral grey and picked out the undersides of them, and that makes it look like little dents and things in the body of the weapon. So here you can see I'm using Naggaroth Night. The first thing you have to do is just completely fill it in. Unfortunately, the wet palette is slightly out of focus. I forgot to refocus it after I'd been having the well palette on top there. It was slightly raised higher. So yeah, that's my fault. But and also the Naggaroth Night is slightly off the top of the camera shot there. So my apologies for that. But yes, this will take 2 or 3 coats to get a good coverage. Also, you will have to wait for this to dry. That sounds obvious, but because this has all these recesses in, it will take longer to dry than normal. So it's going to take a few minutes to dry. Normally, you could put like a layer of paint down, and within seconds you can put another layer on top. Here, because the recesses, it prevents the evaporation process from occurring with the water, and it just makes life miserable because you have to wait for it to dry. So that's why I've cut out skipped there. While I was waiting for it to dry, I did some work on the shiny sections. Now, if you can see there, shiny sections that I've painted in, it's purely painted with pale blue grey. I just picked out the edges, kind of roughly. They need to be neatened up a little bit and things like that. But nothing too fancy. I haven't shown how to do those in the video. I might do them in another video as I paint more of the Dreadnought. But it's very self-explanatory. Like I say, it's just pale blue grey. When I neaten them up, I'll be adding some white on top just to make them extra shiny. But yeah, so just to get back to the glow. So you can see there are, again, 5 paints. One of them just off the top. That's the plain Naggaroth Night. But there are only 2 actual paints that I've used for this. So that was the Morrow White and the Naggaroth Night. And the other 3 paints are just various mixes of those 2. Now, you don't have to worry too much about getting the exact mix down. People always want to know what the exact mix is. The thing is, I don't even pay attention what the mixes are when I mix them. I'm just looking for the colour that it makes. And I just want stages. So as long as you mix it so you get a stage that goes from the dark of Naggaroth Night up to white, and they're kind of like even stages in between. So just mix them on your palette until it looks like you have that stage. I would say that for the first highlight, you only need a small amount of white added to the Naggaroth Night, because white makes a huge difference to Naggaroth Night. And that's because one, Naggaroth Night is not a very opaque paint, whereas white is. So as soon as you apply white, it's like it just instantly stands out, because it's, as I say, much more opaque. You can see as I applied it, I went from kind of just below the curve and painted in between each coil. Lots of people, when they paint the coils themselves. You can do both ways, it doesn't matter. I just thought it'd be interesting to have the glow like poking out in between the coils. You can see the paint as well is reasonably runny, a little bit thinner than single cream. This just allows it to run into the recesses a bit better. If you have it thicker, then you're going to kind of miss sections, just because it's hard. It is really hard to get the whole recess painted, just because you don't have the movement of the brush, and you're going to catch lots of areas. You can see as I've been painting the vertical lines down, the paint hasn't gone all the way to the bottom. That's because you keep catching the very bottom bar. You have to tilt the model more towards you. It's very tricky. You're going to get paint all over that bottom section, but that doesn't matter because you're going to paint over that anyway when you're sorting out the glow. And also it kind of still works as like the light coming through, so the light's hitting the bottom and glowing outwards. So as long as you're keeping the line fairly consistent, these little marks at the bottom are fine. Also, I'd say what you're definitely going to find as well, you can see it fairly clearly here, is you're going to get paint on the coils themselves. Now, ideally, you don't want too much paint on those, because the more paint that goes on those, you're taking away the contrast. And this technique really relies on the contrast to get the glow effect. Also, I've done it so that the glow, or I will have done it so that the glow focuses into the middle of the gun. So you can see now I'm doing a pattern where it's the line in the middle of the coils that's still long, and then as I work towards the edges, it gets shorter and shorter. And you just have to keep doing that with the rest of the colours of the paints. The rest of the tones, really. So you see it gets shorter and shorter, but you still have to take it all the way down to the bottom. Make sure you get that bottom edge in. You can see here, I just painted a line along the bottom. It's a little bit cheating. You have to make sure that these connect at the bottom once you've done that. Don't take the line to go all the way across to the very corners. If you can keep it focused in the middle, that again pushes the glow coming from the centre of the gun. You're also going to find the paint still isn't super opaque even with the white added, but you do want to keep it slightly runny, to rely on that surface tension to kind of suck into the capillary action to suck into these recesses. As I said, so you want to try and avoid getting paint on the coils too much, but to an extent, it doesn't matter too much, a small amount of paint, because it does look like the glow is seeping out, catching imperfections on the coils, all sorts of things like that. But don't forget that you have your Naggaroth Night already on the wet palette, so you can go over the flat side of these coils, but you have to be really, really careful when you do that, because if you get any of the Naggaroth Night into the recess, then it's going to be a horrible time to, you have to go back and basically do the whole process again. So here you can see I'm just doing it a little bit, but just be careful. Always go kind of upwards, away from the highlight that you're doing. So it still leaves like a small transition at the bottom, because again, you leave more paint wherever you remove the paintbrush than where you apply it. So now I'm just going to paint in, actually purposely paint in a little bit of glow at the bottom. You don't have to do this again. I just think it adds a little bit of extra glow kind of effect, because I want that glow to be coming from the middle bottom section of the gun. It's not going to be super opaque. It's a little bit of a pain to get right, to be honest. If I was doing this properly for display, I would obviously spend a lot longer to make sure all these colours blend in properly. And again, I've kind of carried on the same effect where the line is longer, closer to the strongest white glow right in the middle. Then I've gone back over with Naggaroth Night and just helped to blend it in a little bit. Now you might be able to quite clearly see in the video all the little imperfections and things in this blending. As I said, you can spend longer on it if you want to get like a perfectly smooth finish. But also remember, this is really zoomed in and extra bright. So if you see this in your hand, it's going to look pretty smooth and finished anyway. So now we're going back. This is the first highlight colour that we use. So it's only a small amount of white mixed in with Naggaroth Night. And we're just focusing on the curve. Now this isn't really glow. I just put this in purposefully because it looks a little bit weird to have the tops of the coils completely dark. I mean, they almost go to black because Naggaroth Night on black. As I said, Naggaroth Night doesn't have good coverage anyway. It's very translucent. And then painting on top of black, the black primer shows through a lot, which is great for getting really dark purples and getting those transitions in there. But for getting a stronger purple down, it makes life a lot harder. But you see they're just painting that top section on the coil. So this is cheating a little bit, but what it's doing is going dark, light, dark. So it's pushing the dark sections right next to it, but it's also breaking it up so it's not just a boring, flat, dark area. And it's representing light catching on the coils themselves. Now, if you wanted, you could just paint these grey to represent, that they could be like non-metallic metal or whatever. But I thought it best to keep the purple in there, mainly because obviously there's a purple glow. You're putting OSL all the way around the gun, or going to be anyway. So the assumption would be that the purple would also go on top of the coils. So it is a glow. I mean, the light is like the same light that's catching the curve of the gun, but we're doing it purple just so it kind of matches the glow. And also because the gun's already black with those kind of highlights on, so if you just highlight the coils grey on that curve, it's just adding more grey to it. I suppose an interesting thing would be if you painted all the coils non-metallic copper and then did them glowing purple. But you're going to be going over a lot of work that you've already done. It might be interesting, like for a display level piece. In fact, it might actually be something I'm tempted to try out now that I thought about it. But just not for this particular model. Here you can see, so I told you before, don't worry about going around painting those edge highlights with the grey because you're going to be doing it in purple. We've just done it there. Don't go too high on the edge highlight. You want to save that for the front of the glow. You can see here, I've actually gone back and I've actually gone over it with the white right at the very front edge. That's pushing the glow there. And also you can see that I've finished, that I quickly went round and did the glow at the front of the exhaust. But now we're getting on to more of the OSL with the purple. Now you've just heard me say about how Naggaroth Night is awful, has awful coverage, and it's really hard to get a strong purple when you go on top of black. This is going to help in some ways here because you're going to be able to get a smooth transition easily, but it's going to be hard for you to make it look a stronger purple, and you're going to have to add some of the white to it, and then as soon as you add the white to it, you're going to be like, oh, this looks a total mess. So I would say if you like the look of it with, you know, just a very subtle purple glow, stick with that. Don't add any white to the glow, because it's going to, as I said, you're not going to get this smooth looking finish. It's very easy to get the smooth finish with just the purple, but the white will highlight your brush strokes massively. You can see here actually on these purple sections that I'm painting in, I'm not even using the glaze. So if you look on the wet palette in the top left, I've obviously got some Naggaroth Night that I've watered down, around about 5:1 water to paint for the glaze. But I'm actually using mostly just a straight Naggaroth Night off the wet palette. You can't actually see that because the Naggaroth Night is just cutting off the top of the wet palette, so sorry for that. But I am just using the same paint that I used to cover the coils at the very beginning, and that's just so that I can get some of that coverage down, you know, to get a thicker layer. But now here you can see I'm using proper glazing, so I'm actually using from the whale palette the 5:1 watered down Naggaroth Night glaze, and as you can see, I'm being very slapdash with how I apply it. It doesn't have great coverage, so you can afford to do that, and it just helps to blend everything in. You should also see that I'm using a very large brush. Now, that kind of blurry big pink thing, that's my finger. That's because every now and then I need the glaze to dry quicker, so I'm just picking the model up and putting it close to my face as I blow on it. For the glaze towards the highlight. Always glaze towards the highlight, because the further out it is, that gets, you know, a very soft transition. Then as you lift the brush off, more paint is left wherever you've left the brush off, so that will create a more opaque layer of purple closer to the glow. So here on this side you can see where I added a small amount of white to the highlight. I kind of like it without, to be honest, but here you're going to see how I'm going to add some highlight to it. So you can see straight away, oh yuck, look at that. You see all the brush marks, it looks very bitty. And then you're going to have to make a big effort to blend it all in. Especially because you don't want this glow to be as bright as the highlight that you've already put on there. What I end up doing for this is kind of a stippling method, just because the brush strokes are so visible. So it's actually quicker to put stippling down, as you'll get like a smoother finish more quickly, because as you do the brush marks, you're going to see the brush marks constantly as you go over it, so you would have to make them opaque because of the white. You have to make it opaque to hide that. Unless, of course, if you want, you could just glaze the glow on, which would also be fine. It's just going to take you a long time. And again, white doesn't glaze that nicely. It has large particles. It's you're going to see some kind of brush marks anyway. So I was like, well, if I'm going to see brush marks, I might as well put them down as dots. But you are going to have to glaze this down. I've gone a little bit too bright really with this glow at the moment, but I was intending at this point to glaze it down. And the reason that I did it like this was just because it was quicker. Again, if I wanted the glow to be perfectly smooth, I would just glaze it all on. I'd turn all those paints that I've used on the purple for the highlights, turn them all into glazes, and then layer it up. So now back on the big brush. This is a size 4 artist opus, so it's a pretty big brush. I can take, it's got a large well on it, so it just basically means I can apply lots of glaze. And I'm cheating a little bit there, so it's almost a wash with how I'm applying it, just using the tip there. But again, because you know the purple has got such a poor coverage, it does work. You know, it's quite a thick coat anyway. And again, I'm just blowing on it because I put such a thick layer on and it's taken a while to dry. So I've actually made the glow slightly bigger than on the other side, but if if I felt like I could be bothered, I could take the time. Well, I did actually. I took the time a little bit. You can see there, and I did glaze it down more. So you can see it where it doesn't have the massive glare from the my painting lamp. So like all the like the imperfections in the paint, they don't show up. With that horrible shine on everything. And you can just see the pure paintwork rather. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. There's plenty more to come. I'll see you next time.